In this lecture, things will start to get a bit more advanced. And that is because we will now create multiple routers and use a process called mounting. So let's see how all that works. Now, before doing any of that, let's keep in mind that the ultimate goal will be to separate all the code that we have in this file into multiple files. So what I want is to have one file that only contains all of these routes. Then I want to have another file which has the routes for the users. I will also want to have a file which contains the handlers only for the users, and then also one file that will contain all the handlers for the tours. Okay? And so that's actually what we're going to do in the next lecture. But in order to be able to do that, we actually need to now create one separate router for each of our resources. So let's go back to our routes here. And so right now we can say that all our routes, so these 4 routes here, we can say that they are all kind of on the same router. Okay, and that router is this app object. But if we want to separate these routes into different files, so again, one file for these 2 routes and one file for these 2 routes, then the best thing to do is to create one router for each of the resources. Okay, and so this is how we're going to do. It's actually not that complicated, but you will have to wrap your head around a couple of concepts. Okay, so let's start by saying const tour router is equal to express dot router. Okay, so just like this, we create a new router and save it into this variable. All right, and so now let's use that router for these 2 routes. So here we use it instead of app. All right, so now we have 2 router and then route, and then of course the get and the post routes on that router. Now, how do we actually connect this new router with our application? Well, we will use it as middleware. All right, and so that is because this new modular tour router here is actually a real middleware. All right, and so we can say app.use and then the route, but let's keep that for later. So we can use the tour router on our application. And where do we want to use the tour router? Well, we want to use it on /API version 1 /tours. Okay, so again, this tour router here is a real middleware. And we want to use that middleware for this specific route. Okay, and so we use app.use, specify the middleware function, which is this router, and then we specify the route, so the URL, for which we actually want to use that middleware. Okay, and so just like this, we created basically a sub application. Okay, now there's just one thing that we really need to change here, which is these routes in here. Okay, so let me change this here and then explain why it has to be this way. So here we only want the root, and here we only want the ID. Okay, now why is that? Well, it's because this tour router middleware only runs on this route here anyway. Okay, and so once we are in the router, then we already are at this route, so at our tour route. And so this first route that we had here before, we only want to run it at API/version1 /tours. And so that is what this route here now means. Okay, so it's basically the root of this URL. Okay, so of this small mini application. All right, so actually when we create a router system like this, we actually say that we kind of create a small sub app for each of these resources. Okay, so this is the root of our mini application, which is again at /tours. Okay, and then the second route is at /ID, right? And that's because before it was at tours/ID. So it was all of this, so like this. But now this URL here is already in our kind of parent route up here, right? So let's say that we have an incoming request now for /API version1 /tours version ID. So the request goes into the middleware stack, and when it hits this line of code here, it will match this URL here, right? So it will match this route, and therefore our toRouter middleware function will run. So our toRouter is this sub-application that we created, which in turn has its own routes. Okay? And if the request was for /id, well, then it will, inside our mini app, hit this route here, right? And finally, of course, it will run one of these handlers here, depending on the method that was used. So I hope that made sense. And so let's now actually go ahead and do the same for our users. All right. So I will go ahead and create another router here called the user router. And then just like before, it's express.router. Not like that. Yeah. Okay, so user router. And then we need to do the same process as here. And by the way, this is called mounting the router. Okay, so mounting a new router on a route, basically. Okay, so we have now users and here user. And actually, mounting the routers has to come after all of these definitions, or at least after we declare the variable, right? So we cannot use the routers before we actually declare them. Okay, now all we need to do is to go ahead and also change the routes in here. And so just like before, if there is now a request for /API/version1/users/ID, the request will enter the middleware stack, and when it hits this middleware here, it will run the user router because this route here is matched. Okay, and so then it enters the user router, and again, just like before, this here is the root basically in our sub application, and then this here is the entire URL/ID. Okay, does that make sense? So before moving on, let's actually test if this still works. So let's get all the tours here, and indeed it does. So everything still works. Do the same with the users, and also that still works. So we did all these changes and the code still works, meaning that our two new routers are correctly mounted. All right, and with that, we are ready to actually separate our different routers now into different files. And that we will do right in the next lecture.